So today we're going to talk about the main characteristics of living things, hierarchy of living things, taxonomy, and scientific method. So what are the main characteristics of the living things? Well, first of all living things have a high degree of organization, and they consist of organic compounds not only, but they all have to contain organic compounds. They have to acquire and use energy from carbohydrates to move then. They should be able to maintain equilibrium in the internal environment, what we call a homeostasis. They should be able to sense the changes in the environment and respond to these external stimuli. And when environment changes, they should be able to adapt to it, to condition the environment, and even to modify it. And of course, they have to be able to reproduce. So what is the hierarchy of the building blocks of life? It all starts with an atom, which is the smallest unit that is chemically indivisible, unit of a particular element. When atoms, two more, combine, they form molecule, another chemical unit that consists of multiple atoms. Cell is the basic unit of life that is bound by the plasma membrane. There are multiple molecules inside the cell, for instance, a muscle cell. When similar cells, say muscle cells, group together to perform a particular function, they form a tissue. And when multiple tissues combine in one structure, that structure will be an organ. So muscle, epithelial, nervous, and connective tissue will form an organ, a heart. A group of organs that perform a particular biological function, for instance, heart and blood vessels, will form a cardiovascular system. Systems, such as cardiovascular and respiratory and renal, form an organism. For instance, a human, or any other organism for that matter. All individual organisms that belong to the same species and live in a specific area, such as population of lions in the Kruger National Park in South Africa, form a population of organisms, and populations of different organisms, lions, ruminants, rodents, you name it, that all live in, let's say, Kruger National Park in South Africa, they form a community for that area, community of Kruger National Park. When community in the area interact with the physical environment, meaning mountains, deserts, lakes, various climate features, they form an ecosystem of tundra or temperate forest or boreal forest or grassy steppes. All those are different ecosystems, and all those ecosystems form an Earth biosphere. Now, we use the term homeostasis. We need to explain what it is. It's an equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium in the internal environment. The parameters of the internal environment remain within physiological limits. They fluctuate narrowly around the baseline, such as human temperature fluctuates around the baseline of 36-37 degrees Celsius. This is controlled by both responses that are conscious and unconscious. For instance, if you hot, you can turn on the cooling fan and that will be conscious response. And also if you're hot, you will start sweating. And we're going to talk about the feedback systems, the unconscious responses in the human that regulate our internal environment and maintain homeostasis, that dynamic equilibrium. Feedback systems consists of, first, a sensor that monitors the environment for stimuli, and once stimulus is sensed, sensor sends the input signals to the control center. Control center receives those signals, and based on those signals formulates a response and sends out an output signal which reaches an effector. Effector receives the output signal from the control center, and based on that system, carries out the response that is specific to the original stimulus. If the response that's carried out by the effector, this red arrow, ameliorates, reduces, or eliminates the stimulus, it's called a negative feedback. If it instead aggravates or reinforces the original stimulus, it's a positive feedback. So the example of negative feedback is sweating. When body temperature increases, thermoreceptors in the skin sense this, send the signal to the brain. Hypothalamus in the brain receives the signal, formulates the response, and conveys it to the sweat glands, effectors, which sweat, and sweat cools down, human body and body temperature goes down. Positive feedback can be observed in labor when baby's head pushes on the uterine cervix. Uterine cervix stretches. That stretch is sensed by mechanoreceptors that send nerve impulses to the brain. Pituitary gland in the brain releases oxytocin, which is carried to the uterus. And oxytocin stimulates further contractions of the uterus, which pushes baby's head against the cervix even more, which sends more signals to the brain, which leads to the more oxytocin release and more robust contractions. This self-amplifying cycle leads to some cataclysmic change, which is essentially a birth of a baby. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the biological taxonomy, the artificial classification of living organisms into the groups with similar characteristics. This system uses binomial names, names that consist of two words, to identify organisms and demonstrate how these organisms relate to each other. The highest hierarchical level in taxonomy are domains. Bacteria and archaea are prokaryotic domains. Those are single-cell organisms that do not contain nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, unlike eukarya, that have nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. But if you look at the phylogenetic tree here at the bottom, tree of life, you will notice that bacteria branch away from that tree earlier than archaea or eukarya, which means that archaea and eukarya evolutionary are closer to each other than they are to bacteria. In other words, archaea and eukarya are like brother and sister, while bacteria is their cousin. Let's take a look at other aspects of biological taxonomy using an example of a dog. But before that, let's see which other biological taxa lie under domain. So under domain is the kingdom. An interesting feature is that archaea and bacteria represent both a domain and a kingdom. But let's get other kingdoms are Protista, unicellular eukaryotes, fungi, plantae, plants, and animalia, animals. So here you see how we're going to go from the really large group to a very small group. So dogs are eukaryotes, domain Eukarya, and they are animals, kingdom Animalia. Inside of the kingdom Animalia, they have a backbone, so they are in the phylum Chordata. Inside of the phylum Chordata, they mammals, so class Mammalia. In the class Mammalia, dogs belong to the order Carnivora, hunters, carnivorous animals. And inside of the Carnivora, they belong to the family Canidae, okay? Dog-like animals. And inside of the Canidae, they belong to genus, which is called Canis, dogs, along with, for instance, wolf. Turns out that dogs and wolves are the same species, Canis lupus. Inside of that species, Dogs belong to subspecies Canis lupus familiaris. Now, what is this species? Species, as I say here, imply reproductive isolation. So what does that mean? Species can be defined as following. Members of a species, when mate with each other within the species, can produce viable and fertile offspring only if they breed within the species. So reproductive isolation based on that is that members of two different species cannot produce either viable or fertile or both offspring when they breed with each other. For example, lion and tiger can breed with each other and the offspring will be liger. Beautiful animal that is absolutely sterile. Is offspring viable here? Yes. Is it fertile? No, because lion and tiger are two different species. With this, we're going to move to the conversation about the scientific method. So scientific method is the tool that science uses to produce rational explanations to various phenomena that we can observe. Scientific method starts with an observation. My toaster doesn't work. Based on that observation, we formulate a question. Why doesn't it work? And then we use the hypothesis as an answer to that question. Outlet is faulty. Is our hypothesis correct? Well, we have to test. We have to make a prediction first based on the hypothesis. And our prediction would be, if outlet is faulty, then if I plug coffee maker in the outlet, it's not going to work either. So we take a coffee maker, plug it in the outlet, and what's the result? Coffee maker works. What does that mean? Our hypothesis that the problem was in the outlet was not supported, so we need to modify it. Maybe, think maybe it's a problem with the toaster itself. If hypothesis is supported, we would report the results. We would say to electrician, I tried this, I tried that. Looks like there's problem with an outlet. Okay? So, during the results analysis, it's critically important that we imply reasoning that is unbiased, that is rigorous, okay? And that is what's important, not ad hominem. So our skepticism towards one's results, our critique, and our scientific rigor with which we discuss the results and try to analyze them should not target a scientist, but should target the results. We must be sure that results are what they are, and they are interpreted correctly. When hypothesis is tested multiple times in a rigorous fashion, it is considered to be a theory, such as relativity theory by Einstein or evolutionary theory, which groundwork was laid down by Darwin. So in both cases, these theories, evolutionary theory for biology and relativity theory for physics, are the general, important, foundational, unifying principles of corresponding sciences. They're supported by multiple experiments in different areas, the different approaches, producing results that often entangle with each other. But remember, science is not a set-in-stone endeavor. Evolutionary theory was developing over hundreds of years. Theory of relativity has been proven multiple times, and it was developing over time. Quantum theory keeps on developing right now. So it's an ever-changing, dynamic enterprise. Now, in the scientific method, there are three key components. Observation. We need to be keen and attentive when we observe things. Experimentation must be very thorough in the design of our experiment and implement all the proper controls. And analysis. Analysis should be unbiased, critical, and rigorous. When we set up an experiment, we have to identify variables that we want to change. For example, when we compare different cars, how fast they should run the same distance, they should use the same fuel, they should use the same tires, they should run in the same day, the same temperature, same humidity. So the only variable that we would change is a brand or a maker or, a model of a car, Now, when we receive the data, not only, what does it mean critically analyze the data? We must show that our quantitative data are statistically significant, which means that if we run 20 experiments, that not even in one experiment the result occurred by chance. If we run 100 experiments, an experimental result can occur by chance in less than 5 experiments out of 100. Now, based on our observations, we can use inductive reasoning to create a general statement. So based on the results of individual experiments. So for instance, we looked at birds, insects, and bats. They all have wings. And when they flap the wings, they fly. Our observation, wings, enable flight. Now, in deductive reasoning, we go back from the general idea, theory, or hypothesis to the predictions of individual results of individual scientific processes or experiments. For example, we know that chromosomes that contain DNA are equally distributed between the daughter cells and cells divide. So if we observe an individual act of cell division, we can see that we can predict that each daughter cell, as the result of that cell division, will have the same chromosome set as the mother cell. Going back to our example with the birds, we can say if wings facilitate flight, then if we take an insect and remove the wings, this insect won't be able to fly. Now, that concludes our conversation on the lecture 1, and next lecture will be about the chemistry of life.